I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta. The city of Calgary, the University of Calgary is home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would like to thank the University of Toronto Scarborough, the National Advisory Committee, the supporting universities, and all of you who are participating virtually and supporting this national dialogue and action. My comments follow those of my colleague, Dr. Barrington Walker's opening plenary remarks on anti-racism in the Academy. It helps to explain and amplify how and why Black scholars are underrepresented, underpaid, or marginalized, beginning in early schooling and continuing all the way through colleges and universities. We are meeting in an unprecedented moment of social, economic, and educational disruption from COVID-19, but also a pandemic within a pandemic, resurgence of racism, and emboldened acts of anti-Black racial violence. The disproportionate impact on Black and racialized peoples have exposed pre-existing inequities. The death of George Floyd and the global mobilization against racism all point to the urgent need for addressing anti-Black racism and change, to the need to make the universities a more equitable place, and in turn to make our societies more equitable and racially fair and inclusive. One impediment to Black inclusion is deficit thinking. It's implicit in the story of Violet King, a Calgarian and Alberta's and Canada's first Black woman lawyer. Violet King once said, "People told me it wasn't a good idea for a girl to be a lawyer, particularly a colored girl, so I went ahead." King recalled that in a speech to the Beta Sigma Phi sorority in Calgary in 1956. King voiced a prevailing recognition among Black folk that you have to be twice as good to get half as far. And she lamented it. She also lamented, "It is too bad that a Japanese, Chinese, or colored girl has to outshine others to secure a position." King highlighted the intersections of race and gender inequities on Black and other racialized women in the 1950s. And Barrington Walker highlighted, amplified how those judgments and deficit thinking persist today. Whether referred to as deficit thinking, the deficit model, or the deficit paradigm, this worldview explains inequities experienced by Black students, staff, and faculty in Canadian universities and colleges as rooted in their or our lack or deficiency, whether intellectual, cultural, or moral. It is a perspective that blames the durability and stubborn persistence of our disenfranchisement and marginality on our own circumstances. Davis and Musas have identified what they call 4 critical elements of deficit thinking, deficit framing, and deficit perspectives, as it is variously called, and argues that their interdependence and interaction that function to reinforce prevailing inequities, such as rooted in anti-Black racism and Black exclusion. These 4 interdependent elements are also highlighted in the research of Carl James at York, Anna Henry at UBC, and Marlon Simmons at the University of Calgary. Deficit thinking has a blame the victim orientation. Secondly, we must recognize that it is grounded in a complex system of oppression shaped by race, class, gender, and that frame poor and marginalized people as deficient. Further, a pervasive yet often implicit nature of deficit thinking, which permeates social and economic systems, including culture and language, policies and practices, and individual and cognitive structures and worldviews, is that it is embedded in educational systems from preschool to high school, or as often said, from the cradle to the grave. The effects of deficit thinking reinforces hegemonic systems, and in turn reinforces racial inequities rooted in anti-Black racism that lead to lower expectations, what I call the tyranny of low expectations for Black students, faculty, and staff, and reinforces the myth that Black scholars are incapable of being university leaders. We are perpetually framed as the help and as a support to non-Black scholar. Another dimension of the deficit model is that It ignores the relationship between systemic inequities and outcome inequities, since to shift our attention away from the historical conditions of oppression and the inherited structures, policies, processes, formal and informal policies designed without us in mind, to the individualized deficiency or some stereotypical notion of a single Black culture. This deficit model has been naturalized and popularized in ways that deserve that's an open secret, if you will, because it preserves and re-amplifies a racial pecking order, one popularly conceptualized as a cappuccino, white on top and brown and Black on the bottom. The deficit model, whatever the area, schools, universities, the justice system, the public service, legal profession, corporate sector, socially positions Black people as at the bottom of the well, as Derek Bell argued, in Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. He argued in 1993 that Black people are magical faces at the bottom of society's well. Even the poorest whites, those who must live their lives only a few levels above, gain their self-esteem by gazing down at us. Surely they must know that their deliverance depends on letting down their ropes. Only by working together is escape from this conundrum possible. Over time, many reach out, but most simply watch, mesmerized into maintaining their unspoken commitment to keeping us where we are at whatever cost to them and to us. The paradox of deficit mode of thinking is that it exists across ideological perspectives, such that even ostensibly well-meaning people perpetuate this worldview. The tension then is that there are a lot of very fine people on both sides, so to speak, doing a lot of damage in the name of helping, or more paternalistically, saving Black people. Black people don't need white saviors. What they need is for amelioration of structural and systemic inequities. Black students and scholars have long been engaged in their own form of racial uplift and self-help. Instead, Black scholars need teachers, professors, and society at large to take a hard look at how deficit ideology reinforces racial inequity and Black exclusion. The popular language and discourse what we both with Black and Indigenous people, we see with both Black and Indigenous people, for example, is to speaking about closing the achievement gap, but not, for example, the funding gap or the opportunities gap. The idea of achievement gap still centers attention on the idea of Black or Indigenous academic lack, and it functions to produce a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Black children and Black scholars have an intellectual deficit, if they are framed as having an achievement gap, then this unreflexive thinking, such as it is, positions Black children as disproportionately streamed into non-academic areas, but also justifies Black people not being hired, promoted, mentored, and put into university leadership. Any idea of a critical introspective for Black inclusion must focus attention on systemic disparities that begin very early in the education system. Access to preschool and kindergarten, unequal school funding, the need to combat the tyranny of lower expectation that steal Black joy and love of learning, the need to close the opportunities gap, including through extracurricular activities, university counseling, the need to provide access to school, nurses, and social workers rather than policing and racial profiling and racial violence in school. So by way of conclusion, and a critical retrospective for addressing deficit thinking, anti-Black racism, and in support of racial inclusion, I want to highlight 4 areas where Black scholars are leading the way to identify what needs to be done to address Black inclusion in Canadian universities. 1, to close the gap on the knowledge gap, we need Black Canadian studies programs. This provides opportunities to develop pathways and pipelines to the academy for Black students. We are meeting in a moment more broadly where there's a resurgence of Black Canadian studies program. And I think universities, the better universities, are trying to close this gap and to promote Black studies. Over the past decades, we have seen the emergence of this across schools pushed by Black students, faculty, and staff. The second thing we need to do is to see the increase in the endowment of scholarships and fellowships. Many have been named after Black trailblazers. We've also seen the Black postdoctoral fellowship aimed at a few universities, McGill and University of Toronto. A third thing we have seen is student-led initiatives, which require university support. These initiatives include Black graduation ceremonies to highlight Black excellence. And fourth, we have seen a growth in Black speaker series, the mobilization of knowledge. And I want to highlight two at University of British Columbia, for example, including led by Annette Henry, and one at Queen's University. A fifth institutional development is Black Student Association and Black and racialized faculty caucuses to advocate for their collective interests and professional well-being. I think these initiatives across Canadian universities help to support the view, to disrupt the view of the Black deficit. But it also helps to shift our attention away from Blackness as a single story, and to show why, as the Nigerian poet and novelist Ben Akri states, it is easy to forget how mysterious and mighty stories are, multiple stories are. They do their work in silence, invisibly. They work with all the internal materials of the mind and the self. They become part of you while changing you. We need multiple stories of Black lives in order to disrupt this idea of the Black deficits. Stories can change lives or destroy lives. And so Akri says, if we change the stories we live by, it is quite simply possible we will change our lives. Thank you. So I hope now that we will go to our next session, session 2, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for listening in.